I wrote the book for, I think, 2 or 3 reasons. The first one was that I thought that the Western view of that war was distorted, and I wanted to find out more about it, and if necessary, correct it. The second one was one that motivated me writing an earlier book about Moscow during the war. I wanted to get at what Russians thought and felt about it. I mean, war is a very emotional business. You can reduce it to all sorts of things, but at the end of the day, it's very emotional for the soldiers and everybody else. And I wanted to get some feeling of how the soldiers felt about the war. And so that's why I interviewed a lot of them. And the third motive was a different one, which doesn't, I think, appear to the reader, but it was important for me. I mean, I grew up in the Second World War. I spent my boyhood sticking flags in maps. And, you know, I've been very aware of the whole phenomenon of war and why people fight, and I wanted to get that out of my system. I mean, for me, this is also a book about war, not only about the Afghan war. So that was my motivation, anyway, for writing the book. I think the narrative of our narrative of what happened in Afghanistan up until quite recently has been much influenced by our own Cold War propaganda, which I helped to create. I mean, I was in the Foreign Office in January 1980, after the Russians moved in, and we peddled stories like that they were going for a warm water port, they were trying to threaten our oil supplies, that they were going to incorporate Afghanistan into the Soviet Union, and these were the reasons why they invaded. None of that's true. Another thing which is not true is the story propagated in that film, Charlie Wilson's War, that it was the CIA and the Stingers, these handheld missiles, that drove them out of Afghanistan. They had really no effect either on the political decision-making and almost no effect on the military, though they changed their tactics, of course. So the other thing is that this was a peculiarly brutal invasion, that the Soviet army was peculiarly brutal in the way it behaved. Well, they were, all those things, but that's what armies of intervention, fighting guerrillas with very sophisticated technology, that's the way they tend to behave, I'm afraid. When they went into Afghanistan, they did so primarily because the regime there had got out of control. It was killing lots of people, it was shooting its adversaries, and when the Russians remonstrated, which they did, the Afghan communists replied, it worked for Stalin, why shouldn't it work for us? So the primary reason that they went in was because there was this unruly ally on the southern flank, very vulnerable flank from their point of view. So that was the primary reason. The secondary reason was that they did believe that the Americans were going to intrigue against them in Afghanistan. The Americans were just had been thrown out of Iran. So they believed that the Americans were going to move their intelligence listening posts to Afghanistan, where they'd be able to look right into their missile test sites, for example. And Amin, the leader that they overthrew and killed, the communist leader, had studied in New York, and some of his own people believed he'd been recruited by the CIA. And so the Russians believed that the Americans were going to shift Afghanistan onto the other side in the Cold War. Not an entirely stupid idea, because Dulles did try to recruit Afghanistan for the Baghdad Pact. There's a lot of documentation about the discussions which took place in the Kremlin following the rising in Herat, which is in the west of Afghanistan, and which took place in March 1979, so 9 months before the Russians went in. The Afghan leadership appealed to the Russians to send troops because they didn't think they'd be able to master the situation. The Soviet Politburo debated that for 4 days and decided that it wouldn't make sense. They'd just get themselves into trouble. The Afghans ought to be able to look after themselves anyway. There was a lot of impatience with the Afghan leadership for being so incompetent. And Prime Minister Kosygin telephoned Taraki, the Afghan president, and said, we're not going to do it. If we send troops in, we would find ourselves involved in your civil war, and everybody would end up hating us. That's a paraphrase of what he said, but it's the message. They did, of course, what prudent people do, particularly general staffs. They planned for various contingencies. They started building up troops on the border. They started sending people in who could collect intelligence. But they didn't take the decision until really just before they invaded. And that bit is not well documented, the final bit. A lot of people, Russians, who were close to power said, well, of course, it wasn't us, Governor, it was this small clique of old men. I think that's slightly incredible. I mean, enough planning was going on to mean that, although the decision hadn't been taken. The possibility was hanging in the air. The trigger seems to have been when Amin, one of the two communist leaders, murdered the other, Taraki. Taraki, the president, was Brezhnev's protege, and Brezhnev seems to have blown a gasket at that point. And from then on, which was September, the movement was sort of inevitable towards an invasion. They started mustering the troops and so on, and the actual decision was not taken until, I think, the 12th of December. They went in on the 25th of December. And one of the consequences of that was the CIA has been agonizing ever since. Why didn't they predict the invasion? Well, they didn't predict the invasion because the Russians didn't know they were going to invade. They knew a lot about what the Russians were up to from satellite surveillance and so on. They saw the troops moving around, but they didn't predict the invasion, which was a surprise to them. Whether or not the Russians gained anything from the invasion, of course, is a difficult question. I mean, in the broad political sense, of course, they gained nothing. In the broad political sense, they'd failed in their aim. Their minimal aim when they went in was to stabilize the government, stabilize the country, train up the army and the police so that it could look after itself, the government, and then leave. And they wanted to leave in 6 months or a year. Well, that's something, of course, we've heard before. But they had additional objectives. They did believe that what they'd achieved in Central Asia, bringing of a sort of modernization to people who are very similar to the Afghans, clean water, health, development of agriculture and industry, freedom for women, I mean a whole lot of things that they'd sort of done in Central Asia at great cost in blood. They thought they could replicate that in Afghanistan, and there, of course, they failed entirely because the Afghans weren't interested. The Afghans didn't like communists, they didn't like Russians, and they didn't like their women to go around without veils on, and a whole lot of things didn't work. So, to that extent, of course, they failed completely, in the sense that they achieved a minimum objective of leaving a sort of stable, not very stable government behind them, which could more or less defend itself. That they did achieve. They achieved the objective which, in effect, Gorbachev set for them of withdrawing in difficult circumstances with some shred of honor left and leaving behind a government that could look after itself. Now, Najibullah lasted for 3 years. He defended himself rather successfully against the Mujahideen for much of that time. His government started to fall apart for the usual reason of internal intrigue and so on. But the real killer was the Russians. By then, the Soviet Union was finished. The Russians that winter were actually starving or on the verge of starvation. They were bankrupt, and they cut off supplies of fuel and food and ammunition and equipment to Najibullah. His air force was grounded. He couldn't fight any longer, and that was what did for him, finally. So the combination of internal intrigue and the cutting off of supplies did for Najibullah. So, I mean, it was not a very long-term success, but it was a sort of success which enabled Gorbachev to say, well, at least we've done something, and we've withdrawn with honor. They withdrew in good order, and those objectives, leaving a government behind, a communist government, more or less, that could defend itself, were absolutely the opposite of what the Americans and the Pakistanis and the Mujahideen were trying to achieve in the negotiations in Geneva, which brought the war to an end. So to that extent, they achieved a sort of negotiating success against a background, obviously, of political and geopolitical failure. What happened, really, from the first weeks, against a background of the government determined to try and play down this whole war. These soldiers weren't there to fight, they were there to build schools and help old ladies cross the road and things like that. So they suppressed the reporting. But the casualties started to come home. And as one man wrote to the youth newspaper, Komsomolskaya Pravda, he wrote in 1983, so 2 years before Gorbachev came to power, if a soldier comes home, everybody in his village knows. If a coffin comes home, the whole region knows. And that built up. It was the people in the countryside. They surprisingly began to write in. They wrote in hundreds, thousands of letters to the party, to the newspapers, which were referred to the military leadership and the political leadership. And Gorbachev made great play with that.